Welcome to the 38th episode of Dialogika, a podcast between two friends about the latest in society, politics, and feminism in Indonesia and the world. I'm Stephanie Tangkilisan.
And I'm Swedian Lee.
And this week, I had a very special conversation with Dr. Sandeep Nanwani,
who's getting his master's in global health delivery at Harvard Medical School in the Department of Global Health and Social Medicine.
Yes, by this interview, I mean me, because Sweden was off, having his Thanksgiving break while I was working. All week.
Stephanie and Sandeep talked a lot about Sandeep's motivations behind being a doctor and his work with the displaced communities in Indonesia, working with marginalized and invisible voices, in particular the Waria community,
which is often translated as transgender women, but me and Sandeep talked about how it's more nuanced than that. Oftentimes, Warias, which literally means wanita pria or man-woman, are born male but present themselves as women and have no desire to transition.
Stephanie and Sandeep talked about some really great topics and issues that we feel like are often not featured enough in mainstream media, and we're really humbled and grateful to Sandeep that we can share the stories of the Waria and the story of the work that he does. And we're also really excited to feature him as an incredibly inspirational and amazing young Indonesian who's doing really good work. And we're super excited to have him on this episode.
Yeah, through him, I think we were able to discuss in more complexity and detail about the particularities of our culture, which is often really hard to translate and has so much local context that gets lost in shorter pieces. So I hope we do the community justice and hope to feature someone who's actually from that community at a future date.
So, here's to it. So as we mentioned earlier, I'm not in this episode because I was out on Thanksgiving break. But as the first audience to Stephanie and Sandeep's interview, I was really struck by the stories he told and the kind of incredible insights and observations he made as both a practicing physician, but also a young Indonesian trying to solve really important issues and difficult topics in Indonesia. And it makes so much sense that he was featured not only in Afu's Frame and Sentences video on history, but also in an NPR episode of All Things Considered recently about the work that he does. And both Stephanie and I are really excited and humbled to share his story in greater depth and length in this week's episode. And yeah, it's also amazing to have Stephanie in New York and Sandeep in Yogyakarta and still have an amazing conversation thanks to the internet. So, without further ado, here's to Stephanie and Sandeep.
Hi, could you introduce yourself and what you do?
So I'm Sandeep Nanwani. I'm a physician, recently graduated from Medical University in Jogja, and I'm currently doing my master's in global health in Harvard Medical School. But I've been working in Jogja a lot with community-based organizations, specifically Waria, the Waria community, sex worker communities, children living in marginal places in the streets, and any other street-based communities. So I've been working with them to try to provide access to healthcare, but it's really just a very difficult thing to do, even when we know that every Indonesian through BPJS has the right to healthcare.
And that's our national single-payer healthcare system, which supposedly is like universal, but has its problems. I read your article about that, actually. It's really great.
Yeah.
Can you talk about Waria? And I think Waria is often translated into English as drag or transgender, but how do you talk about that, and what do you think of that, working with these communities up close?
So I think of Waria cannot be completely translated to the word transgender.
I agree.
Fairly specific to the Indonesian context. Of course, it has a specific history in Indonesia. If there's one thing that unifies Indonesia, I would say Waria, because you have Waria with the same kind of subpopulations and the same characteristics in Papua, and you have Waria in Aceh, right?
Yeah.
So it's not Achenese, it's not Javanese, it's not Balinese, it's Indonesian.
Yeah. It's untranslatable. It's one of those things that
it's
beautiful about our culture.
Yeah.
So like, I feel like in a way, being transgender in the US, the way it's conceived here, it's more like an individual gender identity. So this has a lot more to it.
It's predicated upon belonging to a certain community. Of course, because you're expelled from home. And often Waria is predicated upon a certain type of job, right? You get money most likely because of sex work or ngamen.
Street busking.
Yeah, ngamen is street busking. What defines Waria, I think, is their work, because their work makes them a community. The Waria has their own setting themselves up in the communities. They often have a matriarch, a mami. They often live in groups, right?
Yeah.
Often in very marginal spaces, which are really reducing now also. So they often live in groups, and they dress up together, go out for sex work together, and then busk. And it's not an easy lifestyle, I would say. I mean, it's not an easy thing to, in a sense, become a Waria. It's very tough, right? To live. And the mummies and the community can be really tough too. Any kind of community often has certain rules and you can often see some exploitation here and there, but they all mean well. They want Warias to be tough as a rock, and that's why they are tough as a rock.
Yeah. How are they perceived generally, and like what has made it necessary for them to be very tough?
So Waria are often tolerated, right? Compared to, for instance, I would say a middle-class gay man or a lesbian couple or whatever. They're often tolerated in the queer spectrum, if we would call it, right? But they are tolerated because they are observed as poor, very marginalized, and, often sex worker needing state help, right? So, how do I put it? So sometimes the dominant requires a poor deviant to show that the dominant heterosexual form of living is the best, because if you deviate from that, you become the poor sex working Waria.
That's so messed up.
Of course, they are marginalized as in other poor people. In cities that are increasingly urbanizing, they're often marginalized, people like not allowed to busk, and informal economies are starting to be pushed down by the state, right? So sex work is also starting to be illegal, and that's their main form of what defines them. So
yeah,
it's kind of like the racism.
Yeah.
The white needs the black to be white.
Oh my God.
Right? You need the other to be white. It's kind of like that, I feel. So that's why they're fair.
Yeah, because sometimes I feel like Western media portrays Waria as a sign of Indonesian tolerance. But when you put it that way, it's also, there's a cynicism to it too. The toleration, behind that, there's a deeper meaning.
Yeah, it feeds into the fantasy, right, of the head. Indonesia is all about the family, right? The heterosexual family. That's the pinnacle of marriage, is the pinnacle of belonging in Indonesia, right?
Right. This is fascinating. Could you talk about the gender identity of a Waria? They don't generally want to have an operation?
So some want to have an operation. I would not try to generalize, but most often they are okay with not having an operation. So the population of men who buy sex from Waria is the same as the population of men who buy sex from women. So
they consider themselves heterosexual?
The men considers themselves heterosexual, and Waria often consider their relationship with these men in a heterosexual manner.
Yeah.
But often Waria acknowledges that they can never be in an emotional or marriage with a man as a Waria. Although older Warias sometimes do get married, but they remove themselves from the Waria world and they get married.
Huh. As a man or a woman?
As a man, they may get married as a man. Yeah. So
they would get a wife?
Yes. So often Waria also have young gay man partners called brondongs.
Oh yes,
who they take care of, materially, buy them food. Waria are extremely caring people, really, really caring people. They really take care of their brondongs, buy them food, cigarettes, whatever they ask, and then they are gladly happy when the brondong is older to marry the brondong off with another woman. So
it's incredible.
So these are the kind of relationships, and of course with themselves, Waria have their own community, as I explained, right? So these are the kind of relationships that as a community they often form.
That's so beautiful.
Yeah, but often when we look at it in terms of sogi or sexual orientation and gender identity, we often forget these material concerns. First of all, like we forget that it's job, which is important. They're sex worker and it's, and we also...
Because there's no alternative for them.
And we also tend to focus on absent loves. My friend just wrote a wonderful article. He's an anthropologist. He wrote this wonderful article on how our models of gender and sexuality often make us focus on absent loves. Like, the Waria doesn't have the male partner, or they want a male partner. But as I explained, in themselves, they have a community, they have brondongs to look after, they have all these wider networks. Waria are the heads of the streets. So they even take care of street children. So they adopt street children, and they grow up and they become like their biological children, and then the children have some money. And these are things that we should be thinking about, which we often, where any like extant models of like gender and sexuality don't think about these first political economy and other present carings, which the present relations which constitute a Waria.
That's really fascinating, and I can talk about this so much further, but I want to get into you.
Yeah, okay.
Like what made you interested in this work, and like what made you get an MD in the first place and eventually end up where you are now?
So what made me get an MD in the first place was my mom died of cancer when I was in high school.
I'm so sorry.
Yeah, so when I was in high school, my mom died of cancer. So she was living with cancer for like 11 years. So my whole childhood has been every summers going to India and staying in the hospital.
Right.
So that has been my summers for childhood. And so naturally, I was very drawn towards the hospital and wanting to be a doctor. Then I entered medical school after my mom died.
Yeah.
And in medical school, I just loved the science. But what made me interested in working with Waria first, and then Waria brought me to other street children, to sex worker, and now mental illness is all through them, was I met this one Waria patient in a emergency room. Her name was Eka. She had rectal cancer, HIV, and very difficult conditions.
Mm-hmm.
I was still a medical student, so I couldn't do anything. But what I did was just hang out, right?
Mm-hmm.
I literally went every free time I had and sat with her for almost the whole year she was sick. And then I met the other Waria community in Jogja. Then I met Mami Finolia in Jogja and Buruli, who were so accepting in their house and so amazing when I saw how they care for each other, how they care for street children, how they care for brondongs. And I instantly fell in love, and I instantly said, let's do something and we should help, and have been there ever since.
Yeah.
And then they brought me to, Waria, say, oh, my street child, my child who is a street children, is pregnant. What do I do? Then I did the whole street children thing. And then because of the vagrancy law, Warias and street children were caught and brought to these camps. So I went to these camps and I saw that almost 80% or 60% of people who are caught in these camps have severe psychotic illnesses, severe schizophrenia. That's what brought me to schizophrenia. So it's been very organic in that sense.
Could you describe the condition of what that institution is like, what that place is like?
Yeah. So camp assessment, it's called. Camp assessment is a place where all the vagrants is like any gelandangan. It can be translated to gelandangan and kepengemis, often called gepeng. Gelandangan and pengemis. And vagrants can be
Indonesian.
And their acronyms, right?
Indonesian acronyms
are the best.
So good.
So gepeng are brought to these assessment camps. In these camps, I know all the social workers really well. I work with them really, really. And in these camps, they try their best to assess what causes someone to be in such situation, and try to do rehabilitation, in the sense, their social rehabilitation to get some. But the form of models in our welfare system, of course, influenced by history and colonial times and so on of our welfare system, relies so much on the presence of a family. As we discussed earlier, right? Indonesia has this thing that everyone is in a family, a heterosexual nuclear family. So they have these psychotic vagrants where they're like giving medications to and telling them to remember their family. And then once they remember their family, they forcibly return the psychotic person back to their family.
Which usually means that there's a reason they left their family in the first place?
Yes, these families are very violent, right? So or the psychotic person could kill a brother, fracture his mother, or do, many things. And the same thing, they do it to children as well. Like, because children also come to the streets because of violent families, right?
Oh, man.
So my research now has been like, okay, you return to your families. This is what happens in the families. So I've been looking at and trying to critique the family. That's in a sense,
yeah. What's your experience with the authorities? Are they open to criticism? What's their mindset like?
They're extremely open to criticism. So I often, get into friction with activists in Jogja because I work with the state. I completely work with the state, despite knowing that they're violent. I work with the state for a reason, because they are the ones who are going to provide me insurance. They are the ones who are going to provide me healthcare costs, right? For people who are extremely sick, who spend like ratusan juta or hundreds of millions in rupiah in ICUs. In hospitals. So I have to work with the state. And I think as I said, why we are in the position we are in is often, if you ask a social worker, if you ask a person in Dinas Sosial or the social welfare ministry, or the provincial social welfare office, they often will say it has always been like this. They often will say, I don't know why it is like this. And they often know the problems, but it has always been like this. So I think we need to look at history more carefully, and why we have social institutions like that is often because of a complex history. Indonesia was colonized, right? So it has a certain understanding of welfare because of its colonization.
Oh, so many questions that I want to ask in what you said. There's so many good things. So one thing is like you work with authority to kind of try improve the conditions for people.
Yes.
And they're somewhat receptive to it sometimes. And right.
Yeah.
And you're in friction with activists because of that?
I'm not in complete friction with activists in the sense they don't hate my guts, but of course, they do.
Yeah, no.
They do.
I understand.
Waria have taught me one thing. They often will also work directly with the state for state welfare. So I've learned from their models to extend it to other things. And, I don't want to romanticize poverty. And I often have friction with activists because they're against the law, the vagrancy law, as it's like catching people in the streets and not allowing freedom in the streets and so on. But I want to think a bit more in depth. I don't want to romanticize living in the streets also. We should just ask what people want instead of assuming what they want. And people may want different things. And, it has always been a key lesson of mine, which I always thank the Waria for, to always be able to manage the state and state workers and the community receiving care, and try to manage to listen to both.
Going on a different topic, especially with Waria, how has the political situation both locally and nationally changed for them in the last year or two?
So 2016 was a terrible year for LGBT. LGBT has become politicized as a way which I kind of don't understand what it means. Because it's like, what is LGBT? It's like, it's this ghost. It's this sort of like PKI. What is PKI, right? Sort of this haunting ghost. I actually wrote my final paper on how LGBT is this.
Really?
It's not an acronym. It's this ghost. It's based on my interviews with protesters. So in Jogja in 2016, there were a massive anti-LGBT march. Huge march. And so I interviewed some of those people who joined the march, and I asked them, so what is the threat? Why are you walking down the street, marching, Awas Bahaya, or beware of the danger of LGBT? Why are you doing that? And they're like, oh, LGBT is this latent threat that can be in anyone. Our children can have it. This person can have it. Can be in anyone. And then I said, but isn't Waria, like, you give money to, because the next day after the protest, I see someone with the same jacket giving money to Waria. So I asked the guy, like, he's like, oh, Waria and LGBT is different. That's what he says.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so I kind of think of it as the same way as well. Because LGBT is not even gay, not even transgender, it's this LGBT. If you look at newspaper articles, apakah kamu LGBT? That kind of like, it has occupied a political position of the PKI, kind of like the communists, like the drug trafficker. Because Indonesia suffered 32 years of autocratic rule in which everybody was socialized to be suspicious of themselves.
Yeah.
Right? They were socialized to be suspicious. Am I PKI? Am I not PKI? Am I LGBT? Am I not LGBT? And that's the kind of politics of LGBT, which is quite odd, I would say. I don't use the word at all. State workers don't use the word at all. I think that we need to be more smart in thinking of what position politically the word.
What's the hardest thing about doing this line of work so far?
The hardest thing about doing this kind of work has been, one, seeing a lot of deaths. I see a lot of deaths, like dying people. And two, it's just, the hardest thing is like you meet someone, you try to get the best kind of care available for that person, do so much just to find out that in the blink of an eye, the person can be gone and run away. And that, I think, is the worst kind of heartbreak I'll get often so many times. And like, I just had a woman, who, was once my star patient. She used to be the beacon of hope, right? She's really sick, HIV positive, really, really sick, kicked out by their family. One of her child died of AIDS, really terrible conditions, right? Got access to healthcare. And, she's recovered, and she was working as a maid somewhere, getting some money. And then she got this street kid boyfriend now, and then she's run away with the street kid boyfriend now, and is essentially living in the street now. So she was so good. She was already there. It was really hard to know that, that. So it's like, it's just every day you're against precarious structures and this huge violence. And you have to just go on, I think. But my biggest fear is being numb, actually. My biggest fear is as long as I can feel hurt, it's fine. But I don't want to like feel numb. That's like the worst fear I have. So that's how I give solace to myself, right? At least I feel something, right? Nothing at all.
So what's like one of the happiest moment or like special moment for you, like in doing this work to offset the death and dying and heartbreak?
There's so many happy moments. So many. 2 weeks back, I was eating, and this one friend who was a street kid before, not literate at all, was severely ill, got 40 injections. Can you imagine? 40 injections for his TB. And he went through all that, and now he has angkringan, and he was cooking food for me, and he said...
What's angkringan?
Angkringan is this small cafe by the street. And he cooked for me, and he's like, "Oh, this is on me." And he paid for his, like, he said, "This is on me." And I was like the happiest person to see that. He has some security, and like, and you know, some make it, some people make it. Although he's not that great living in a great place, because, you know, he's still poor, but, you know, better than what he was. Yeah.
I think that's it.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, and keep doing the awesome work.
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for listening to this episode. You can find more information and resources of whatever we talked about on our website, dialogika.id.
Music credits to John Dealey, Lee Roosevelt, and of course, Broke for Free.
If you like what you hear and want to support us, please review our podcast on the Apple Podcast app or whatever app you use to listen to your podcast. And please share our podcast with your friends. It's the best way to spread the word about Dialogika.
If you want to get more involved, we'd love to hear from you. Our email is dialogikapodcast@gmail.com, or just shoot us a message on our Facebook page.
You can also find us on Instagram, YouTube, SoundCloud, and now Twitter. Please follow us on these various platforms. Our Twitter handle is @dialogikapod. Also, follow me on Twitter. It's StephTank. That's STEPHTANGK.
Thank you again, and see you guys next time.
Bye!